Yeah. Uh, Good evening, everyone. Extremely sorry for the delay. There were some backend issues, and today we will be discussing hepatocellular carcinoma, the surgery for hepatocellular carcinoma. So the last one we discussed the basics, and in continuation of the same, we are now discussing the surgical options. And we have a esteemed panel. We have Dr. Sanjay Govil, who is a HPV and transplant surgeon at Apollo Hospitals, Bangalore, and Dr. Asit is a dear colleague. He will be the moderator for panel discussion. Then we have Dr. Fani Krishna Raula, who is an entrepreneur as well as a very good surgeon at Hyderabad. We have Dr. Arif Ali Khan, who is a GI surgeon at Fortis Escorts, Delhi, and Dr. Murli is at Caritas Hospital, Kocham, and we have Dr. Biswajit from Nemcare Hospital, Guwahati. So we'll ask Dr. Sanjay Govil to briefly tell us about approach and technical considerations for hepatocellular carcinoma.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a special thanks to Dr. Nikhil for giving me this opportunity and Dr. Asit Arora as well. This is a fairly broad topic, and so I hope to, and I expect to cover it over the next 20 minutes. Sorry, one second, slides, yeah. Okay, so hepatocellular carcinoma, as you all know, is the commonest primary liver cancer. And I learned a new term recently. I believe it's a liver addicted cancer. And what that means is that the tumor essentially remains confined to the liver for a large part of its natural history. And this is beneficial to us in the form, in terms of being able to treat these patients. This cancer, as we all know, commonly occurs on the background of a diseased liver. And this obviously has implications with regard to not only the diagnosis, but also surgery and the nature of surgery and a high incidence of recurrence. Screening of high-risk individuals allows early detection and consequently more effective treatment. Approximately 60% of screen detected HCCs, that is on the basis of an ultrasound with or without alpha fetoprotein, are less than 5 centimeters in diameter and therefore are amenable to effective treatment. As I mentioned, the current standard of care is ultrasound, 6-monthly ultrasound with or without AFP, but increasingly an abbreviated MRI protocol is being utilized and being tested, and this may actually increase the accuracy and the benefits of screening. The diagnosis of HCC is can be accurately made radiologically and is supported, of course, by tumor markers. Biopsy is usually unnecessary. Unfortunately, it tends to be overused and is potentially dangerous from the point of view of seeding as well as of bleeding. Now, this slide shows the characteristic features of HCC on an MRI, but it has exactly the same features on a contrast enhanced triple phase CT scan. So you see an arterial phase enhancement in the first part of the slide with venous washout as you go into the portal venous and the delayed venous phases, and then appearance of the enhancing capsule. Additional important features are threshold growth between scans. So if you had repeated scans and the tumors increased in size, that's very important. And this is a very, very characteristic appearance and does not require any form of biopsy to confirm the diagnosis and institute treatment. Smaller tumors, especially tumors which are less than 1 centimeter in diameter, can sometimes be a little difficult to diagnose because they may not have all the typical features. But again, this diagnosis can be made either with follow-up scans after an interval of 3 months or with the use of hepatobiliary contrast agents like Primovis with MRI. And even a non-contrast T2 weighted MRI, which shows hyperintensity, is strongly suggestive of a hepatocellular carcinoma. In these smaller tumors, the EASL guidelines recommend biopsy, but I personally cannot remember ever having biopsied a lesion that small, and we usually would watch these lesions or do some additional form of imaging to clarify the diagnosis. So if you've done a CT, do an MR. If you've done an MR, do a CT. Contrast enhanced ultrasound is a very good modality. We don't have it available where I work, but I believe it is available in places in India. Now, broadly, I'll just go over the principles of resection of an HCC. Obviously, you need to stage these tumors accurately. There must be no extravascular disease, and you must have identified all the tumors that are present currently in the liver to the extent possible. In cirrhotics, this will often mean you will probably need to get an MRI in addition to a CT scan in order to be able to delineate all the tumors better. This picture up on the top over here explains why anatomical resection is preferred over non-anatomical resection, because the tumor tends to grow into the portal vein radical, which is supplying the tumor. And that's why you prefer an anatomical resection along that portal radical. However, compromises may have to be made in order to preserve hepatic parenchyma. All that is, the benefits of an anatomical resection are not that great. It's preferred, but it's not something that is essential. The margin that is required is only a histologically negative margin, and it's very clear that aiming for a margin bigger than more than 1 centimeter is completely unnecessary. Torzilli and colleagues have emphasized the importance of what they call the R1 vascular resection margin, which means that when, say, if you have a tumor like this and it's applied against, let's say, a big hepatic vein, rather than resecting the hepatic vein and therefore ending up having to either do a major resection or losing a lot of functional parenchyma, it's perfectly acceptable to simply peel the tumor off or dissect the tumor off the venous, the vein or the vascular structure to which it is adherent. And this is called an R1 vascular resection. It has an equivalent survival and nearly equivalent survival and local recurrence rate to an R0 resection. The use of indocyanine green, which is taken up by the tumor. This is a well-differentiated HCC, which takes it up uniformly. This is a moderately differentiated HCC in which there is more rim enhancement. But either way, especially during laparoscopic surgery, even at open surgery, if you use this, and I personally have no experience, but it helps to ensure that one has obtained an adequate surgical margin. You clearly need to minimize blood loss. This is usually quite easy to do if you've got an experienced surgical and anesthetic team managing the patient. But if you need to do any form of, and also because of the kind of gadgets we use during surgery, but if you need to, I would advise, do not hesitate to do some form of inflow occlusion, as long as you follow the rules, of 10 or 15 minutes clamping and then 5 minutes release. This will do no harm when you perform a resection. Minimally invasive resections are better tolerated by by patients, especially those with cirrhosis, and are preferred if one has the experience to do them. And these patients need close follow-up because the recurrence rates following resection of HCC can be as high as 70%. Now, the main influencers of the outcomes of surgery are vascular invasion, tumor differentiation, the degree of background liver disease, and of course, as with any surgery, the performance status of the patient. And we'll just run through each of these. Now, macrovascular invasion is relatively easy to identify on radiology, and it's a very poor prognostic sign, as we all know. But microvascular invasion, as seen in this picture over here, where tumor is completely within this vascular channel, is known to increase the risk of recurrence of these tumors after resection by about 4 to 5 times. It's difficult to diagnose prior to resection, and so we end up using various surrogates to determine its presence. Tumors larger than 5 centimeters have a 70% or greater chance of having microvascular invasion, and that's why size is the most important surrogate marker for microvascular invasion. Tumor number is also indicative of vascular invasion, but is less important than size, because we know that this is a field change in a cirrhotic liver. So it is possible to have multiple tumors without necessarily having microvascular invasion. But size is very important, and the 5 centimeter, you'll see it being repeated. The TNM classification, the BCLC staging, HKLC staging, and most of the extended criteria, most of the transplant criteria, all you'll see repeatedly using the 5 centimeter cutoff for resection or transplantation. The extended transplant criteria don't often increase beyond 5 centimeters, although many of them accept a larger number of tumors. There has been an attempt using radiology to identify the presence of microvascular invasion, and it is fairly accurate when it is seen, this peritumoral enhancement or irregular tumor margins. However, it is not very accurate, and it's still something that we don't have a very good handle on. PIVCA is another, is also a high PIVCA is also indicative of, more indicative of a vascular invasion. Now, tumor differentiation. Poor tumor differentiation is definitely a poor prognostic sign. Biopsy, liver biopsy, despite its limitation in terms of sampling error and also the potential complications, can diagnose it with reasonable accuracy, but it's not generally performed for the same reasons, because of the sampling error and the complications. And once again, we therefore use surrogates. Alpha-fetoprotein is one such. Levels above 1,000 either suggest a metastasis or very poor differentiation. And generally, one would not offer these patients surgery directly if they had such a high alpha-fetoprotein. These patients would be treated by some form of, usually a transarterial therapy like TACE, to try and downsize these tumors. And only once the alpha-fetoprotein comes down below about 400, at least down to below 400, 500, would one consider surgery for these patients. Even the modified up to 7 criteria, which I put the picture here, require, adjust the number of the number of nodules and the size of the nodules based on the alpha-fetoprotein. Approximately 1/3 of HCCs do not take up PET tracer. High SUV is suggestive of poor differentiation and poor prognosis. PET scan is generally recommended only for patients who are beyond Milan or UCSF criteria prior to resection or transplantation. But high SUV is once again an indication of poor differentiation. Now, background liver disease is perhaps the most important aspect that we have to consider when we're offering these patients surgery. The feasibility of resection is determined by the functionality of the remnant liver. Resection is only feasible for patients with Child's A, very early Child's B if it's a limited resection, and MELD scores which are below 10. ICG retention at 15 minutes is often used in the East and is increasingly being used in our own country, and many centers use this routinely. We've used it on occasion. And major liver resection is contraindicated in patients when the ICG retention at 15 minutes is above 10 to 20%. The Imamura protocol advocated by Makuchi et al. Is well known to everybody and easily available, and one can utilize it to determine the extent of safe resection. 99 technetium galactosyl serum albumin scans are not available anywhere outside Japan. Primovist MRI, which uses a hepatobiliary contrast agent, is being developed to determine functionality of the remnant liver in proportion to the whole liver. But as yet, it is not accurate enough for routine clinical use. Now, we know that since most often this tumor occurs on a background of either NASH or in cirrhotics, one would need either a 30 or in cirrhotics a 40% functional liver remnant. And obviously, we would all prefer the remnant to be as large as possible and the resection to be as minimal as possible while being able to remove the entire tumor. So preoperative augmentation of the remnant is possible by a number of techniques as I've listed here. The new kid on the block is the total venous deprivation, in which there's portal vein embolization as well as hepatic vein embolization. But we have no experience in this, and what we have used in our center has been a sequential TACE and portal vein embolization or a TARE in order to control the tumor as well as induce hypertrophy in the opposite lobe. ALPS has also been used. I have certainly not used it. It's also very important to determine whether there is clinically significant portal hypertension. Hepatic venous pressure gradient greater than 10 millimeters of mercury, one should not do anything more than the most limited resection because the risk is extremely high. Any patient who has varices already has an HVPG greater than 10 millimeters, and therefore formal measurement of the HVPG is not warranted in patients who have varices. However, the other clinical parameters like platelets below 100,000 and splenomegaly greater than 12 centimeters are not very accurate. And although in the past we have used HVPG, whenever we've had a doubt about the degree of portal hypertension, increasingly today people are using FibroScans. An LSM greater than 20 kilopascals is absolutely definitely associated with clinically significant portal hypertension, but between about 14 and 20, it's not so accurate. And if you get an LSM between that number, you need to get either do an HVPG or use one of the other parameters such as splenic stiffness, which is supposed to be very accurate to corroborate whether the patient has clinically significant portal hypertension or not. Now, some centers have combined liver resection with splenectomy, either sequentially, that is the splenectomy first and a subsequent resection, or simultaneously to reduce portal pressure with apparently good results in their publications. I have no personal experience, but I believe this is quite a risky strategy and I would not really advise it. I'd be interested to know if anybody else has experience in this. We have used partial portocable shunts or splenorenal shunts in some patients in combination with liver resection. Once again, I would not advise it. It worked very well in some patients, especially when they were children. But I can remember at least one patient where it was a complete and utter disaster, and we all wish that we had never, performed it. Now, I'm not going to go into the details, but everybody knows about the common classification algorithm for management is based on the BCLC classification, which is beloved by all gastroenterologists. But I believe it is much too conservative and does not reflect what we actually perform, what we do in our clinical practice. And the Hong Kong Liver Clinic classification, which came out some years ago, is probably more in keeping with what we do. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details. You can look at these slides later on. But there's no doubt that in direct comparisons between the HKLC, BCLC staging systems, the survival was better significantly with the Hong Kong system. And I think that that is what we should all be following rather than the BCLC system. Now, I want to go through the clinical scenarios in which we all come across HCC and just discuss each scenario. So let's take HCC in a non-cirrhotic liver. It's uncommon, probably less than 20%. It's relatively safe and has a good 5-year survival. It's most commonly, it is diagnosed on a background of NASH, and therefore you need a reasonable FLR even in these non-cirrhotic patients. But in a small group of younger patients, one may see fibrolamellar HCC, which must be differentiated particularly from a fibronodular hyperplasia. The diagnosis of HCC in non-cirrhotic livers is often delayed, and these tumors are often very advanced at diagnosis. But please remember that especially in fibrolamellar HCC, limited metastasis do not preclude a resection. And I'm sure many of you have successfully performed resections in the presence of isolated omental, diaphragmatic, and even quite extensive peritoneal disease where we've done peritonectomies and have achieved 5-year survivals, although not cures in any patient once they have metastasized. So one may it's possible to perform an aggressive resection in these patients with a non-cirrhotic liver because the liver is healthy with preserved function. And whenever volume enhancement is required, it's extremely effective. Now, what about the cirrhotic patient where the tumor is within Milan criteria? Obviously here, the controversy is whether one should offer these patients. Obviously in patients in whom both resection or transplantation is possible, then one should offer, whether one should offer them a resection if it is a resectable tumor or a transplant. The survival, overall survival is very similar with both, perhaps slightly better with transplant. But the big deficiency of resection is that because of the cirrhotic field change, the recurrence after liver resection at 5 years is approximately 70%. So disease-free survival is quite poor in following resection. For those within Milan criteria, recurrence after transplant is only about 50% against 50 to 70% after resection. Salvage transplant for recurrence after resection is theoretically a very good option and may be effective in some patients, especially those with hepatitis B related cirrhosis. But in clinical practice is actually possible on only about 1/3 of the patients who recur because they present outside of, with a quite extensive disease by the time they're diagnosed. So the benefits of transplant actually only accrue quite late. Overall survival benefits have become apparent only about 5-7 years after transplantation, and disease-free survival benefits at about 3 to 4 years after transplant. So you need to individualize the treatment for your patient as to which is ideal after discussion with the patient. And the benefit of transplant drops off quite significantly if you have a long waiting list for an organ, especially if the wait is beyond 6 months. Hepatitis C is now no longer a problem, but it was one of the factors which, fibrosing cholestatic hepatitis post-transplant, if it did occur, was associated with a high mortality, but it's really a more or less extinct disease at this time. Now, what about large tumors? So if you've got a large tumor, which is beyond 5 or 6.5 centimeters, then these are probably better for reasons that I mentioned earlier, the high incidence of microvascular invasion. These are better considered for resection than transplant, in my opinion. If transplant is to be considered because of poor liver function or portal hypertension, then it's better to perform some sort of downstaging to try and get a better outcome. Operative mortality and survival are reasonable in these tumors so long as the principles regarding resection that we've already discussed are adhered to. And there's no doubt that resection is definitely better than TACE as a therapeutic option if resection is at all feasible. So in tumors which have got where the liver function is preserved adequately to permit a resection and the volume is adequate, residual volume can be brought up to an adequate remnant, then definitely perform a resection. But obviously, if the liver function is not good enough, you may have to perform some sort of downstaging treatment. Most commonly, we're talking about a TACE in this situation. And if you're able to reduce the tumor size and other parameters such as the alpha-fetoprotein and the SUV and things like that are favorable, you may reconsider the possibility of transplantation in some of these patients. What about multiple tumors? Obviously, this is a difficult problem, but as previously mentioned, the number of tumors is less of a concern than the size. Excellent results with resection have been reported with up to 3 tumors, and there are a few series from Italy and China where more than 3 tumors have been resected with 5-year survivals, which are not bad, in the region of about 15 to 30%. But patients need to be individualized depending on the size and the number of the tumors. Smaller tumors up to 3 centimeters in diameter, especially when centrally placed, are better treated with ablation than resection. Laparoscopic resections, as I mentioned earlier, are better tolerated, particularly in cirrhotic patients. And often it is a combination of resection and ablation which is used to treat these tumors depending on their size and location. Extended transplant criteria, which I've listed the whole, quite a number of them here, will, allow up to, the maximum is 10 tumors in the Kyoto protocol. And it may be considered in selected patients with poor liver function, but this has to be discussed in detail with the family, and you need to make a decision based on the serum alpha-fetoprotein, the tumor differentiation, PET scan, etc. Both for large as well as multiple tumors, often downstaging is necessary. There's been a subtle shift in the way one thinks about downstaging. Previously, you thought when you saw the patient, you put them into a category of either resection or transplant, or you said, okay, we'll do a downstaging, and if they don't downstage, we go for transplant. But this seems like a small difference, but in fact, what the approach is that if you're not able, if the patient is not amenable to a resection and you need to, because of poor liver function, then you're not going to stop treating that patient. You continue to treat the patient with TACE, TARE, ablation if it's appropriate, the newer drugs which are now, checkpoint inhibitors and all the rest of it. And you may find that over a period of time, a subset of these patients will bring their, you'll get their tumors down to a size where one, might yet consider transplantation or resection. And It's an ongoing treatment in these patients. You need to just continue treating them as long as it's possible to, and a proportion of these will become, amenable to resection or transplant. Portal vein tumor thrombosis is an extremely poor prognostic sign. Many of these patients are much too sick to be operated upon. However, we all see patients with tumor thrombus with preserved liver function and good performance status, and these patients can be candidates for surgery, although we don't often do this. The advantage in this scenario is most often by the time they present to us, this group of patients, the opposite lobe is well hypertrophied. But one should be cautious about going directly into surgery for these patients, because the outcomes are not good, because the remnant usually has microscopic tumor, which then becomes apparent following the resection. You need to stage them carefully. It's generally recommended that one treats the primary with TACE or TARE, and possibly even SBRT in selected patients, and then allow for a short period of observation, and then offer them, the ones who are still suitable for resection, consider them for resection. In whatever data is available, and it's not good data, resection provides approximately a 1 year additional survival over other modalities of treatment. But there is a selection bias here, because these are clearly patients who are, have a better performance status, and are better off, would survive longer probably anyway. Now, until recently, portal vein tumor thrombus. Okay, one other thing: if the tumor thrombus has gone into the main portal vein, generally this is beyond any form of surgical treatment, and I think everybody would agree to that. Recently, there has been a resurgence of the role of transplantation in patients with portal vein tumor thrombus. It's extremely controversial, but a few centers around the world, including our own Medanta, have published reports which are extremely promising. They presented a protocol of management which is extremely promising and with extremely promising results. I think this still needs confirmation from other centers. We are scheduled to do our first transplant for portal vein tumor thrombus later on this month. So I can't really tell you what the, I don't have personal experience in this, and my knowledge is essentially from the literature, but the protocol is the same. TARE followed by SBRT to the tumor thrombus, or to the tumor thrombus. Make sure that there's no uptake on PET in the tumor thrombus, and then proceed with transplant. And finally, I'd like to just present the last clinical scenario of a ruptured HCC. Ruptured HCC is often a pre-terminal event in patients with very poor liver function, and obviously in these patients, you're just going to give them whatever sort of supportive care. However, it does occur in patients with preserved liver function, either due to a congestion in the tumor because of a hepatic vein occlusion, or because of a very necrotic tumor which ruptures. In such cases, obviously, the priority is to stop the bleeding, most often with transarterial embolization. Rarely some form of ablation, radiofrequency or microwave may be used in combination with it. Some people like to do a laparoscopic peritoneal lavage to wash out the blood and also potentially spill tumor cells in these relatively preserved patients once the acute bleeding has been controlled. And then once the patient is stabilized, you reassess the whole clinical situation. And based on the rules that we have discussed earlier, you can then decide about whether this patient is amenable to a resection. So a delayed resection gives the best outcomes. Transplantation is not acceptable in this scenario because you're likely to have peritoneal disease. And I think I would like to end with that. And I hope that I have covered the topic as was expected by the organizers. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. You indeed covered it very well, and it was very informative in nutshell. Uh, there are a couple of questions, rather only one question. Dr. Arvind Menon has asked a question. Arvind, are you around? You can unmute yourself and ask. So he wanted to know the radiological diagnostic criteria and non-requirement of biopsy. Is it applicable to HCCs in normal liver without a background of cirrhosis?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, if you have, many of these tumors occur in patients who've got background NASH or fatty liver or something. It's rarely going to be an absolutely plumb normal liver. But if they have the characteristic features as I've described, that is arterial phase enhancement, washout, capsule, you do not need to do a biopsy. Where it sometimes becomes, if you have a doubt in the diagnosis, by all means do it. But when you have the typical features, you do not need to do a biopsy. Sometimes the confusion comes between fibrolamellar HCC and FNH. And in such situations, sometimes a biopsy is necessary. Once again, if you've got an MRI, and you've got a good radiologist, it's usually fairly, a biopsy is most often not necessary. So all I'm saying is, if you have the typical features, do not bother with a biopsy. It doesn't matter whether the patient has cirrhosis or does not have cirrhosis.
Correct. We have another question from Dr. Basant. Dr. Basant, please ask.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, sir. Sir, I just wanted to ask whether lymph node involvement in the POTA is an absolute contraindication for resection, or if there is an involvement, should you do a USFNA of the lymph nodes, or how do you approach patients who have some amount of lymph nodes in the POTA hepatitis with HCC?
So most of the time, these lymph nodes which are seen are not metastatic lymph nodes. They're mostly, when you do a biopsy on them, you'll find that there's just granuloma or some non-specific thing. Clearly, if you have a very large lymph node, then I don't think there's any point in doing, not much. You're going to get very little benefit from doing a resection. You can go ahead and do a resection, but you have to be clear that you're not likely to get a very good outcome. So, you have to discuss this with the patient as to what benefit you're likely to provide them. I have never, to my knowledge, done an EUS biopsy. I know that it's a protocol in the patients who you prior to transplant in Medanta, but prior to resection, I have not done it ever. I have refused to do resections on some patients who have had obviously involved large extrahepatic lymph nodes. If I've had a doubt whether the lymph node is involved, I would, most often go in favor of operating. And if I operate, I will not back out because there is a hilar lymph node. I will, just do a lymphadenectomy at the same time. But obviously, this means that the patient has a poor survival. Now, all this may change in the future with the advent of such good, we've always had useless drugs or pretty near useless drugs, and treatment has been largely surgery based. But now with the advent of, the newer drugs, all this may change in the future. there's no reason now, you might want to consider doing resections in these patients because we now have all these various multi-kinase inhibitors and checkpoint inhibitors and various other things. Of course, unfortunately, because of the expense of the checkpoint inhibitors and all that and immunotherapy, many patients may not be able to take it. But in selected patients, it may still be appropriate. And I think this may change in the future.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I don't know whether I've
And we
answered
have,
your question.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
we have one question from Amit. Amit, can you ask that question? So Amit wanted to ask about R1 vascular resection. I'm not aware of, he has quoted Torzilli data that there is some benefit of R1 vascular resection.
Yeah. That's what I mentioned, that if you've got a tumor which is adherent to, say, the right hepatic or middle hepatic vein, then rather than resect that vein and run the risk of having to, having a huge area of your remnant being congested and non-functional, it's perfectly acceptable for you to simply dissect the tumor off the vein. It's usually not infiltrated. It's just that there is no plane between the tumor and the vein. And so you can dissect it off, and that is called an R1 vascular margin. And an R1 vascular margin has equivalent recurrence or very similar recurrence rate and survival figures to somebody who has had an R0 resection. So this is one instance in which an R1 margin, which is limited to the area of contact with the vessel, is an acceptable alternative for two reasons: that the outcomes are similar, and secondly, because it is much safer for your patient than sacrificing that vein and potentially having losing functional liver in the remnant.
Yes, that explains everything. Actually, the way he has framed the question, it appeared as if he's talking about R1 vascular resection, not R1 vascular margin. So that's self-explanatory. And with this, I would request Asit to take over the panel discussion and
I'll
discuss it further.
share my screen, and I hope.
Nikhil, can I have one last question?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
Yes. My question, Dr. Sanjay Goel, was about a slide about the large tumors, the large HCC, because that's one area where the the medical oncologists and medical gastroenterologists also write it off, like the BCLC. So wouldn't you say that in the absence of poor prognostic factors, like let's say the large tumor without macrovascular invasion and without a very high AFP, size alone is not a poor prognostic factor? Purely based on size in the absence of all these, if it's a well encapsulated tumor.
You're right. I mean, in the sense that, perhaps it's not by itself. If everything else is, if there's you've got a low AFP, you don't have any uptake on PET, then you're selecting out, a good prognosis tumor. But the fact is, actually, if it is resectable, irrespective of the size, whether it is a good prognosis tumor or not a good prognosis tumor, resection will probably provide the best survival if it can be done safely compared to, say, TACE or TARE or any of the other alternatives, at least at this stage. If we get better medical therapy, then God knows, it may all change. The whole treatment of HCC may turn on its head. But as things stand, if you can resect it, even if it's a poor prognosis tumor, you're probably going to get a better survival than if you don't resect it. So it's finally, it's based not on your decision to resect will not be based so much on the tumor as based on the functionality of the remnant and the portal hypertension and performance status and those kind of factors. That was my point. I mean, that's what I was trying to say. But you're right. A good prognosis tumor is a good prognosis tumor. There's no question.
Right. So I think, can you see the screen that I've shared? Is it?
I'm just going to put the fan on. I put it off.
Yeah, sure. So can you see it, Nikhil? I mean, is it visible? The
Yeah,
screen?
yeah, Sid, we can see
Okay,
and
fair
just
enough.
enlarge it. I mean, presentation mode.
Yeah, there I'll do. So basically, I think Sir has covered more or less everything in his crisp and clear talk. And most of the things we're going to discuss here would be sort of repetition. So, but I would like to engage all of our panelists because I would want to know what is the real life practices that we are following in each of our institutions, so that we can learn from each other and so that our residents get a comprehensive idea of how to manage these patients in real life, right? Rather theoretical. So we have an esteemed panel, like you know, and some of you are my dear friends and colleagues, and some of you I've met for the first time, and I've been really glad that we are doing this. All of you are very prolific HPV surgeons, but as I know, a couple of you are into active transplant. So those of us who don't engage into active transplant, we have inherent bias towards offering our patients resection more than transplant. And we know that for a cirrhotic liver, which has an HCC because of its field change, transplant is the treatment modality of choice, which gives the best 5-year survival and disease-free recurrence. But having said that, transplant practically is more often not feasible than it is feasible in our context, especially in northern India, where we have very seldom cadavers available, and living donor is the only option most of the time available to our patients. So I would want to know how we actually are proceeding towards offering resection to these patients. And unlike other diseases where it is the tumor and patient factors which, in oncology, so my practice is primarily oncology nowadays, so we take care of tumor factors and we take care of patient factors. But in HCC, we have another very critical factor, that is liver, and we have to factor in it. So I would want you to know, so when a patient just walks into your OPD, so I'll start with Dr. Govil here. So, and I would want all of our panelists to answer these questions one by one. So, say when a patient just walks into your OPD and he's carrying some radiology, how do you assess that this patient is HCC with an underlying cirrhotic background or not? Most of the times we would rely on probably subtle radiological markers. So what are these things that you would look into your CT scans or an MRIs to just give you an idea whether this is a HCC in the background of cirrhosis, it's an HCC in a non-cirrhotic or a fibrotic liver?
So first of all, you look at the patient. I mean, obviously, if this is somebody who's an alcoholic, if this is a very obese patient, long-standing diabetic, your antennae sort of go up. Could we be dealing with some background cirrhosis? If they're hepatitis B or hepatitis C positive, then clearly you're seriously concerned that they will almost certainly have background cirrhosis. When you look at the radiology, you'll have this cos echo texture on ultrasound. You may have you'll have an irregular. You may be able to identify the irregular surface of the liver. There may be a little bit of fluid. The portal vein will maybe dilated over 10 millimeters in diameter. The left lobe may be, there's a shift in the volume of the liver. The left lobe becomes larger than the right, or more equivalent in size. There's caudate lobe hypertrophy. You may see collaterals on ultrasound or imaging. Splenic enlargement, again on blood tests, low platelet count. All these features would, low albumin, borderline albumin, these would be features that are going to, basically you should have a strong suspicion that this patient has got cirrhosis. And frankly, if you see anybody who is over around 40 years of age and has come to you with an HCC, the likelihood is this is going to be on the background of cirrhosis much more than otherwise.
Agreed. So, Dr. Fani, in your practice, I mean, we are seeing more and more patients who are NASH-related cirrhosis nowadays. I mean, it's becoming as big an etiology like an alcoholic cirrhotic or a Hep B or Hep C cirrhotic. So, I mean, you may not have a very, fulminant picture of cirrhosis, maybe very subtle signs, right? So, how do you go about assessing these patients in your clinical practice?
So when you have a patient with obviously NASH and diabetes, fatty liver and diabetes, the likelihood of NASH cirrhosis is more. So in those kind of patients, other than this overt radiological features, I mean, the liver elastography is a very good test in these group of patients. I mean, sir was mentioning 20, but for us, I mean, anything more than 10 kPa of liver stiffness indicates F3 or F4 fibrosis. So in those kind of patients, they would require further evaluation by a biopsy.
20, I was talking about an absolute limit for clinically significant portal hypertension. Cirrhosis usually is around 12 to 14 in that sort of.
So anything more than 10, if this thing, definitely we would biopsy them pre-op. Then in addition to what all you mentioned, we would look for, do an endoscopy for varices. And another important, any atrophy, hypertrophy in the right and left lobes. More or less, I mean, in addition to the obvious, looking for splenomegaly, portal hypertension, like you said, the subtle would be mainly to look at the patient if coexistence of diabetes is a high risk factor, then transaminitis is that they could have ongoing inflammation, and we use liver elastography and biopsy in these patients.
Right. So Arif, if I can have your views on this, I mean, you are into an active transplant program. I know your inclination would be more to offer transplant to these patients more than resections. But if you have to assess these patients for fitting into resection criteria, so what is your approach of assessing this patient?
So if there are subtle signs, if it's evident on CT scan, like as you said, texture of liver, left lobe hypertrophy, caudate hypertrophy, and widening of vessel. So obviously, it's evident. But if there are subtle signs on CT scan, so I would prefer to do a fibroscan or elastography and go in for a liver biopsy.
Right. So
if
I mean,
it's evident on fibroscan. If it's obvious on fibroscan and upper GI endoscopy shows varices, action may not be done. But if again the fibroscan is not very suggestive of cirrhosis, then we can go for liver biopsy.
Right. So I mean, most of you have mentioned fibroscan in your assessment. I mean, probably it's peculiar to us whether you have faced this dilemma or not. So Murali, I mean, you would have remembered many a times when you have a large tumor in right lobe, because fibroscan is probably most of the readings comes from the right lobe, the bulkiest part. So if you have a big tumor in the right lobe, fibroscan values are basically, you can't rely upon them. So how reliable would be a fibroscan in the cirrhotic settings with an HCC? Murali, your take on this.
Yeah, usually I don't do fibroscan routinely, because even in LBS I have seen the sisters who are doing a fibroscan, she used to diagnose HCC, because she has told like there is something unusual and we have done ultrasound and diagnosed HCCs. So routine in my practice, I don't do fibroscan. Routinely, I do upper GI endoscopy. If it's a significant varices, then I won't work it up much, because cirrhotic liver is there. So surgical resection may not be feasible. So depending on the size of it and the MELD criteria, I will go ahead with the non-invasive approaches, like whether RFA or TACE may surface. So fibroscan routinely I'm not doing in my practice.
You're not doing fibroscan routinely in your practice for assessing liver stiffness or liver cirrhosis.
Yeah, if I'm a borderline confusion, the patient is having a good performance status, I will ask the interventional radiologist to check the HVPG, and depending on that and the volume, volumetry also I'll check, and depending on the performance status, and I'll discuss with the patient, then only I'll take up for surgery.
Right. Okay, now there's an important aspect of assessing, doing liver biopsies from the normal liver, non-tumor liver, right? So, I mean, this is one aspect where we can actually assess patient's grade of fibrosis, whether it's grade 1, grade 2 fibrosis, grade 3 fibrosis, or it has gone into cirrhosis. So I would like to know, I mean, from all of you, I mean, what is your clinical practice? Do you ever advise liver biopsies from the normal liver to assess the grade of fibrosis or to establish cirrhosis in patients? And do you use it to select out patients for resection? So we'll start with you, sir, Dr. Sanjay.
Look, I would go about it first by looking at the volume of the remnant. If I've got already, I can ensure that I'm going to get a more than 40%, 40 or 50% remnant, then I'm, I would just then try and determine the degree of portal hypertension. If necessary, I mean, the alternatives to a fibroscan are either, an MR, if you can't make out clinically, or with endoscopy. The alternatives are with either with an MR or actually measuring the HPPG, both of which we have done on occasion. And then I would just press, if I have an adequate volume and no clinically significant portal hypertension, good liver function, good performance status, I would just go straight for surgery. I have very rarely done a liver biopsy from the normal side. I can probably maybe once or twice. That's about it. I very rarely have done it.
So what would be that indication? So if you've done it once or twice, what was that exact indication?
So the situation is,
so maybe a borderline resection, I mean borderline FLR.
So the FLR is borderline. I'm not rather than biopsy, the most important thing is a borderline FLR. But rather than biopsy, I would rather, what I've tended to do is try to, and I don't know whether this is right or wrong, but this is what I've tended to do. I've done a TACE for the tumor and maybe a portal vein embolization if necessary. If I don't get adequate hypertrophy, I'm not going to proceed with a resection in that scenario. But if if I'm truly stuck and I can't have any, I'm not sure what's going on, I would biopsy. But it's very, very rare.
Right.
Very, very
Dr. Funny, in your clinical practice, do you ever resort to this modality, doing a liver biopsy from a normal liver to assess the
actual practice, like actually the speaker before Sanjay was saying that even both FibroScan and biopsy are rarely used tools. I mean, we do them, the FibroScan, even we do it frequently, but both FibroScan hardly ever decide medical management, because patient comes to you with overt, child's B8 or portal hypertension, splenomegaly, varices, they're all ruled out. In whom, and let's say in a patient who has a surface lesion in which you're planning a non-anatomical resection also, we are okay. Only in this selected group of patients in whom all these parameters are okay and we're planning a major hepatectomy, like more than 2 segments, like a right hepatectomy most of the time. If you're planning a right hepatectomy, only then we look at, we're really worried, and then we rely more on a biopsy of the normal liver, because even the pressure, either preoperatively or intraoperative pressure measurements, the FibroScan and biopsy of the normal liver, these are only for this selected group of patients in whom none of these features are there of chronic liver disease in the preoperative evaluation, and we're planning a major hepatectomy. Hello?
Agreed. Yeah, it's a troubleshooting thing that we might come to your. Okay, I think there is. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's a troubleshooting tool. I mean, for those difficult situations, I would say. Dr. Biswajit, I mean, if I can have you on board, I mean, what is your practice? I mean, did you ever had to resort to a liver biopsy from a normal liver prior to planning a resection in an HCC in a cirrhotic patient in whom you can't, make out whether a borderline volume is good enough? Is it 50% and in a fibrotic liver or a cirrhotic liver? Did you ever have to do this, and what is your take on this? Dr. Viswajit, are you there? Nikhil, can you check if he's there? I thought I saw him.
Yeah, we did,
Yes,
but
sir. Yes,
yeah,
sir.
he's there.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah, we can. Absolutely.
Sir, sir, we don't do liver biopsy. It is hello.
Yeah. We can hear you. Please go on, Dr. Viswajit.
We don't do routinely liver biopsy, sir. Generally, we in large liver as well means HCC, and this question of low FLR. In that cases, and there is a confusion of the fibrosis and the cirrhosis. In that cases, if fibroscan is in borderline, in that case we used to go for liver biopsy. Otherwise, routinely we don't do the liver biopsy.
Perfect. Murli, what are your practices? I think at ILBS, we were quite fond of doing liver biopsies from a normal liver, and we have shared a lot of such experience. So what is your practice right now in Kerala?
Right now, I'm not doing routine biopsy of the normal liver. The one thing HPCG positive is like I'll check the DNA PCR. Most of the time, it may be first time diagnosed. They may be having a very high DNA PCR. So, and the borderline FLR is there. I will not go for a resection also in between. We'll start the antiviral. Sometimes stage hepatectomy may be planned. Means like first stage or something. Transaminitis is there. I'll wait for the transaminitis settle after treatment. So meanwhile, we can go for a local regional therapy, then wait, and according to the response, we'll go for a stage hepatectomy. But DNA and routinely, because if I'm doing a resection, I'll get the biopsy of the other margin also. They will take I'll talk with the pathologist so that I'll get the margin. Means a normal liver, what is the fibrotic stage?
Right, perfect.
Routinely, I'm not doing.
Right. And Arif, what are your practices at Fortis? I mean, do you ever do liver biopsies from the normal liver?
No. We don't do routinely liver biopsies from the normal. But see, if you have got a remnant of 40 or more than 40%, and on radiology, it is evident that the liver is cirrhotic, and you have other indicators of portal hypertension like esophageal grade 1 varices or splenomegaly. So obviously, if you have got adequate remnant, there is no point in doing a liver biopsy because you can go ahead with resection. Okay. Now, if the remnant is less and there are only subtle features, there is doubt on CT scan whether the liver is cirrhotic or not, or on fibroscan, it is not very clear that the patient has fibrosis or cirrhosis. Then definitely, and the remnant volume is less than 40% or maybe 30-35%. Then definitely, I would like to know how much fibrosis is there, and if it is normal, if there is no fibrosis or if it's normal, then definitely we can go ahead with resection even if the volume of the liver is less than 40%. So if there is a adequate remnant volume, cirrhosis is evident on imaging, we won't do the liver biopsy routinely.
Right. I agree. It's not a routine thing to be done. It's we also use it very selectively, sparingly as a troubleshooting agent, like you said. When you have a very borderline FLR and when you don't know whether it's in the range of 30s and 40s, and we don't know whether we are dealing with frankly cirrhotic liver or fibrotic liver, I mean, we also end up doing it very, very sparingly. Okay. Now, right. So again, now comes to the assessment of severity of portal hypertension in cirrhotics, right? This is another aspect, and Sir also brought it out in his talk that the clinically significant portal hypertension. And so first of all, let me ask all of you, how many of us are actually doing HVPGs in their routine practice? So Dr. Govil, are you doing HVPGs there at your center regularly?
No, I mean, we are doing it whenever there is a doubt, but like I said, if there's obviously, there are varices, or on the CT, I'm seeing clear-cut big collaterals or, big spleen, and, there's no doubt about that being clinically significant, I wouldn't do it. But if I have a relatively low threshold for doing it if I'm seriously considering a resection. More recently, we are trying to see if we can do away with it. But frankly, if I have any doubt, I'm much happier having an HVPG than not.
So you have the facility. If required, you can
Yeah.
bank
It's
upon
an
it,
easy
right?
procedure to do.
Right.
It's an easy and fairly quick procedure to
Right.
do.
Right. So, Dr. Fani, are you employing HPPG in your clinical
We have
practice
the
to assess
facility,
portal
we
hypertension?
mostly do it in the TIP scenario and not in the HCC scenario. The reason is, in fact, most of the cases, if everything else, I mean, is child's A, the portal hypertension, all the other parameters are okay. And the and based on the LFTs, whatever we made a decision for HCC, the pressure, we measure intra-op. I mean, on table before and after clamping, let's say right hepatic vein, after clamping the right hepatic vein, if the pressure goes high, we routinely do a shunt. So it's sort of we've stopped measuring HUPG for in the cancer scenario.
Right.
You've had safe outcomes with the shunt. We've had some horrible disasters with the shunt when I was in Chennai. When we do a shunt in some adults, we had patients who were just in full-blown encephalopathy and never woke up and went into liver failure like horribly.
Sir, instance like right, I mean, these were not borderline cases. They were cases based, other than the HPPG, everything else was good in them. The volumes, the performance status, and everything is good. But in addition, so the pressure measurement in our centers, so what I've been following for so many years, it's never a pre-op thing. I just measure intra-op routinely for all the major hepatectomies. And if
I think this is something that you should let people know. If you're doing shunts regularly, then it's something that you should either present or write up, because
so what you're measuring would be the portal pressure, not the HVPG.
No,
yes,
he's measuring
direct
portal
pressure.
Yeah, so you're measuring direct portal pressure. Yeah.
And
So
it's a dynamic, because after you post resection also you measure, and then that is more prognostic. A sudden rise it goes, especially about 20, it's like terrible. But we are about 12, we would decompress it.
okay. Murli, what about you? I mean, you are employing HVPG routinely for your assessment in cirrhotic livers for patients who are planning for resections?
Initially, when I started, I was for the safer side. I did a HUPG initially. Then slowly I started selecting only if it's a borderline. If I'm very high risk patients only, then only I selectively use. Nowadays, I use more for other indications like cirrhotics having any gastrectomy or Whipple or anything. For selecting those patients, I used to use. For HCCs, not that common. If I'm comfortable with the upper G endoscopy, I won't do. Only in selected cases.
So you're relying on indirect markers of assessing significant portal hypertension.
Can I make one point, Dr. Asit? Can I?
Yeah.
No, if you have a,
Yes,
if you're a center which has got ICG available, and we have done this on occasion, that whenever we've had the opportunity to use ICG, if you get a normal ICG retention or within your 10 or 20%, whatever the limit is, you don't again need to do a portal pressure measurement. So that's another way of
right. So I think point well taken, sir. Yeah, I think we will discuss ICG in the coming section again. And so, Dr. Biswajit, how do you assess clinical portal hypertension in your setting? Are you relying on indirect markers, or do you have facilities of measuring HVPG and you're employing that?
Sir, we don't have a facility of HVPG. We are relying on the indirect markers only, sir.
Okay, you're doing a UGI and platelets, and based on that,
yes.
and sphenomegaly. Agree.
Yes.
Fair enough. So basically, the consensus would be that HVPG is not mandatory, and most of us have not usually using it in our clinical practice, routine clinical practice nowadays. Secondly, would a history of decompensation and absolute contraindication for resection in your patient who have had ascites but presently is well controlled on diuretics, would you consider this patient for any form of liver resection? So I'll start with you, Dr. Govil. Would you consider this patient for resection, or this is an absolute no for you?
So,
present ascites is absolute contraindication. We know.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a couple of situations. Now, if you've had I think this may be somewhat theoretical, but anyway, if you've had somebody with, say, hepatitis B, and it was untreated, and they had a decompensation, and then they were treated, and then they recovered, or perhaps even an alcoholic who had been drinking, who has stopped drinking and has recovered. then I would probably not be that concerned about, I would probably accept that patient. But if it was a patient who recovered just because of, you started them on a salt-free diet or diuretics or something like that, I would be cautious about doing a major resection. I might go ahead and do a segmentectomy or something like that. But I think I would be very cautious to do a major resection in such a patient.
I'll just take a leave for 1 second. I'll have to plug in my laptop. It's
Sure.
running low on. I think Murali, you made the same point. A patient who is a treatment naive, Hep B, who has very high DNA load. This patient could have decompensated momentarily. So if you treat him with antivirals and wait for a couple of weeks or maybe a couple of months, and this patient
Definitely, if there is just like Sarah's told, if there is any decompensation because of acute on chronic hepatitis, we'll wait for that acute hepatitis part to get controlled. We'll wait, then we can. So most of the time in my practice, if it is a cirrhotic liver and if it's a high risk, then I will not go for a major resection. Even minor resection also, I think, because we have got very good, if it's a small tumor less than 5, we have got very good loco-regional therapies. So why should we go for a surgery? And the cost is also very less. So better go for a non-invasive loco-regional therapy, either RFA or TAST. And
Where are you working, Dr. Murli?
sir, I'm working in Caritas, Kottayam, sir.
In Kottayam, okay.
Kottayam, sir. And right now I'm partly working in Government Medical College Kottayam also.
Okay.
So the new department has started there. So part-time I'm working there. Slowly I'm planning to move out from Caritas and going towards medical sector. If I am comfortable there, I'll continue there.
I'm so sorry I got locked out of my presentation. I think my computer just shut down. I think I'm doing it with my phone. Let me just share my screen 1 second. Oh gosh. Nikhil, are you around? Can you share the presentation? Nikhil?
Dr. Asif, it doesn't matter about sharing the presentation. Go ahead and ask your questions.
Right, but I myself can't see it. So that's the problem. I have to.
I see.
Okay. So, right, we will continue, I think. So basically, what we have come thus far is, obviously, we have assessed the clinically significant portal hypertension. So we were discussing about whether we can have a resection in a decompensated patient or not. So is it in your case, I mean, you said if patient had a transient decompensation, which can revert back, it's not an absolute contraindication, but otherwise it's an absolute contraindication.
It depends on the etiology. If it is something like hepatitis B or alcohol or something like, or maybe a drug which is completely reversible, then, or near completely reversible, then you would consider it. But otherwise, if it was, because of natural history of disease, and then you've intervened medically to try and manage the decompensation, then I think that kind of patient one should not consider for resection. or if at all you're considering a resection, it should be an absolutely minor one, probably laparoscopic or something like that. And, probably best to find some alternative to resection.
Right. Perfect. What about in a case of child A cirrhotic or a child B cirrhotic? What is your cutoff? I mean, can we offer, are you offering any form of surgery to a patient who is a good child B, say CTP7 or a CTP8? Are you happy offering surgery?
Very limited, very infrequently is I don't know what the others do, but I'm very wary if their child's B. If it's a very limited resection, CTP7 or something like that may be laparoscopic minimal resection, but otherwise no.
Right. So Dr. Fani, what about you? I mean, are you happy offering resection to patients with a low MELD score or a child A or early child B patient? And what kind of resection would you happy doing them?
Absolutely. So, I mean, one thing is all these discussions, one thing we have to clarify, we're talking about major hepatic resection, that is more than 2 segments. So for, something like a hanging tumor, a non-anatomical resection, we may venture into somebody with more MELD more than 10 or even early B7 or something like that. But for major hepatic resections, in fact, we should look for reasons not to operate. I mean, Sir has explained very well that, in alcoholic hepatitis selected scenarios, history of decompensation or child's B, most even when sometimes in the literature you have results, but what I have seen, our Indian patients generally tend to do much worse than what I've seen in Japan and the UK, and the NASH patients generally tend to do badly. So in major hepatic resection, never in child's B.
Okay, so basically, in a clinically significant portal hypertension, obviously we would resort to only minor hepatectomies, but that's not an absolute contraindication. There is plethora of data now. I mean, we had a very good publication in Annals of Surgery in somewhere around 2016-17 when we had this Daniel Cherky group who said that it's safe to do resections even in clinically significant portal hypertension, and the survival is as good as for other patients. So that has made some kind of a paradigm shift in our practice, and we are much more liberal in offering surgery to our patients, since we are not a transplant unit anyway, so we are more liberal with our resections. Okay, now about functional assessment of liver. How many of us are actually doing functional assessments? Are we doing ICG routinely for our patients before resection? Are we following the even Dr. Govil mentioned the Makuchi's criteria, in which volumetry along with ICG is clubbed together to have the amount of volume that can be safely resected, or are we following any other method like MEGEX? So I would like to know from all the panelists. I'll start from you, Dr. Govil. Are you doing ICG routinely for your cases?
No. I've used it on a few occasions when somebody brought a sample, but I'm not using it.
Okay. So what about you, Dr. Fani? Do you have facility of doing ICG retention in your centers, and do you use it as a...
Centers in India do ICG. No, we've never used it. Wherever I've also have not seen them using the ICG much.
Right. Murli, do you have any experience outside of ILBS? I mean, at ILBS, we used to do ICG left, right, but
in my practice, I'm not doing. It's not available in our centers. So I'm not using.
Okay. Arif, do you have ICG at Fortis?
No. We are not doing it. ICG, we are not doing routinely. We rely on liver function and just volume. That's it. No other investigation. No, ICG we don't have.
Okay. Dr. Vishwajit, what about you? I mean, do you have experience of using ICG to chart out resections for your patient? Do you think it is essential, or do you think we can get away without doing it?
No, sir, we don't do, sir. We don't have availability.
Right. So basically, consensus is that ICG is not a mandatory thing to plan out resection. If you have good assessment of volumetry, if you have good assessment of the degree of portal hypertension, and if you select our patients well, you can get away without having ICG. So we used to have ICG, and we used to use it quite routinely till we were in ILBS, me and Nikhil. But since we have moved out of institute, that facility is not there with us anymore. But we do have a couple of centers in Delhi, where our colleagues are using ICG very routinely to chart out their resections. And I think there is hardly any difference between the overall results of our resections versus their resections. So I can safely say that it's not something which is absolute mandatory. Okay, what about FLR assessments? So how are you calculating future liver remnants for your patients? Are you using any specific softwares? I mean, do you have Miriam or anything else to do it, or you use it manually with the help of your radiologist? How is it done at different centers? I mean, I'll start with you, Dr. Govil. How are you using it?
Yeah, so we don't have any proprietary software. We're doing it with our radiologists, but we do have there's a company in Bangalore which, for a very small fee, does a formal volumetry, and we cross-check our volumes with them whenever we have any doubt. And certainly for all our donors, we use that software. So that's what we're doing.
All right. And what about others? What about Dr. Fani? How about you? I mean, you're using any proprietary softwares, or you're using it manually with the help of your physio radiologists?
Both for our LDLTs and for the cancer patients, we're using the in-house software, the regular. We don't do any MEVIS scan or anything special like that.
Right. And you're happy with it? I mean, what is the correlation with what accuracy you are finding it? Do you find, so if you're doing it for LDLT, you will always measure the
LDLT in the actual volume. There's a fairly decent discrepancy. While in resections, we're looking at the percentages. What proportion are we leaving behind? So I think for proportions, it's fairly okay. But for the actual volume, it's always less than, at least in our setup, it's a 10 to 20%. It's always
20%.
less.
Exactly. It's always going to be about 15% less in volume, but proportions, it's quite accurate, as you said. Absolutely.
Right. Murli, what about you? How are you doing it?
Just like the normal CT software only.
Okay, the normal CT, you do it manually. You just
Manually, with the radiologist.
Right. Arif, what about you? How are you doing? You're using
normal CT software with our interventional radiologist.
Right. And Dr. Vishnu,
We don't have any other.
how are you calculating your volumetries?
Yes, I would radiologist normal CT software, sir.
Right. So basically, the crux of the matter is that you don't need those fancy softwares to guide you in your volumetries and resection, and most of us are very happy doing it normally. So, okay, what are the different cutoffs that we are using for our resections? I mean, for a normal liver, for a steatotic or a cash liver in which patient has some sort of fibrosis, or a frankly cirrhotic liver, what are the cutoffs that you're using? Are you as aggressive as literature says that you can go up to 20% in normal liver, up to 30% in a steatotic or a fibrotic liver, and as low as 40% in a frankly cirrhotic liver? Or you are more conservative like we are, we tend to err on the side of safety? So I'll start with you, Dr. Govil. How are you going about with your volume?
I want more than the 20, 30, 40.
Right.
Certainly, at least 5% more than that. I may be willing to go down if it's a child. I mean, if in a pediatric patient or in a very young patient. But anybody who's a little bit older, I just want more. I would never. I definitely at least 5% more than those.
Right. So you're still braver than us. I would say I would have at least 10% margin. I would never go for less than 50% in a cirrhotic patient.
I'm also very nervous if it's less than 50% in a cirrhotic.
Right. So what about others? I mean, Dr. Fani, what is your take on this? I mean, would you be very aggressive or you'd be conservative with the volume?
Definitely in the setting of cirrhosis, I mean, when basically we are looking at all these things in terms of major right-sided resections, right? So, I mean, even I feel like it should be more than 45% at least. And because FLR means, functional liver assessments of I'm sure you're coming to that later. But for us, so any high risk patient, if you're in a CLD setting, we're going in for a right hepatectomy. In addition to the volume, the functional liver assessment, one good way we use is the portal vein embolization. So that response to that tells us. So we would hardly consider in a high risk over 50 patients with chronic liver disease for a major hepatectomy. You hardly ever have left lobe which is 40% or more. So almost always you need some sort of a augmenting procedure, and that gives you a good functional assessment. The amount of hypertrophy you see also. So that is also a part of the assessment actually for us.
Yeah, so I mean, the reason why we are a little conservative on this is one, because we are only relying on the volumes. We are actually not aware of the functionality of that remnant liver, since we are not employing any of those functional liver assessment tests like ICGs and MEGEX. So we would rather are on the side of safety than be aggressive and end up on the losing side. Murli, how about you? What is your aggression level? You are anyways a very aggressive surgeon, so how are you going about it?
Normal liver 30 to 35 above, always on the safer side, and cirrhotic liver also 45 to 50 above. And always try to, even if I'm planning for an anatomical resection, I'll try to preserve the at least a venous outflow and at least a part of 8 or 4A or something, so that there should not be any decompensation. It should be more than 50%. There should not be any congestion in the remnant part. Basically, the outflow, I will not have any obstruction. That's what I give more importance. And almost, even though I try for an anatomical, most of the time I'll try to end up in a non-anatomical parenchymal preserving resection, especially in cirrhotic, so that more than 50% I'll get. Because my calculation may be 45, 50, sometimes 60 I can. And albumin I'll be supplementing aggressively, just like I was in ILBS.
Okay. And what about Arif? What are your thoughts on this?
In cirrhotic patient, I would prefer to have a remnant of at least 45%. But in normal liver, 30%, depending on the age of the patient. If it's a young patient and a normal liver, 28-30% is okay. But definitely a patient who is old age patient will prefer to have a little bit more remnant volume, more than 30. Many times in our donors, we are okay with 28-26% as well. Especially when the donor is young, we have taken livers with a remnant volume of 26-28% as well. We tend to keep more on the right side of the middle hepatic vein. But in these cases, we have to get a margin, R0 margin. So we would prefer to have a maybe normal liver, older patient, 30-35 will be. But in cirrhotic, definitely 45%, above 40-45%.
Yeah, you're still braver, man. I would have hard time going below 50% in my patients, but yeah. Dr. Viswajit, what is your take on this? I mean, how aggressive are you with your resections, and
in a normal livers, I tends to preserve more than 35%, and in cirrhotic as much as I can, more than 50%. I'm very happy.
Right. So, I mean, the caution is the word of the name of the game here, right?
Yes.
Okay. And what about the tumor-related factors, sir? There are some things that Dr. Govil brought out in his presentation. Is a macrovascular involvement absolute contraindication for resection in your patient? So, if patient has a subsegmental or even a segmental portal vein involvement, would you consider these patients for resection, or would you not consider these patients for resection? I mean, not talking about transplant here, only for resection. So would it be a contraindication in absolute terms for you or not? So I'll start with you, Dr. Govil. I mean, what do you?
No, it's not a contraindication. But if there is a significant portal vein thrombus, I would probably do some form of TACE, at least TACE, before I did a resection on these patients.
So would it matter if it is a bland thrombus versus
no.
thrombus?
No, hang on. I'm talking here of a tumor thrombus.
So if the tumor thrombus is in main portal vein, I think most of us would not venture.
It's out, yeah. We're talking about a subsegmental or segmental. I would have
so even for a subsegmental and segmental portal vein involvement, would you do a TACE prior to going in for surgery?
Depends more on the alpha fetoprotein and so on. If the PIVKA or alpha fetoprotein is very high, then I probably would. I mean, I've only recently started doing PIVKA, I have to say. So
Yeah,
I don't have much experience, but if the alpha fetoprotein was, high, I would do a TACE first and then a resection.
Right. So, what is your approach in this scenario, Dr. Fani? Would you consider these patients for resection, or would you want a TACE prior to resection?
Bland thrombus, let's say going in for a right hepatectomy, if the bland thrombus is right portal vein, I'm in fact more happy in sense that already the post-operative portal pressure injury does not occur. So that is in fact a pro factor. If the patient has a macrovascular thrombosis, we should be more aggressive in our workup. I mean, get a PET, or if you don't have a PET, CT chest and bone scan at least, and don't select patients with a very high AFP, more than 1,000. And of course, if the patient is I think ideally, like Sir said, if the patient is affordable and willing, it's some sort of a downstaging treatment and follow-up, like SBRT with TACE, something like that, and downstaging treatment and follow-up to look at the biological behavior before you select your patient. But if the patient is not, willing for all that, I wouldn't mind going in these patients. And in the very large tumors, again, in the volumetry also, when you have a single very large tumor, the other advantages, we should look at the non-tumor parenchyma as the denominator, right? I mean, that also sort of the patients tolerate it better rather than looking at the overall liver volume. The non-tumor parenchyma should be included in the volumeter.
Right, absolutely. So that's a very valid point. In a large liver, it's not the absolute volume, it is the tumor-free volume that we should be bothered about. And okay, another scenario would be that Sir brought out was of a tumor rupture. Many times we see a spontaneous tumor rupture in our cases. And so what about in a spontaneous tumor rupture? Would that case be an option for having a surgery? So we had a small discussion in this prior to in Sir's session. So what about what are the approaches that we are following in this? I'll start with you, Dr. Govil. You had briefly, but can you just elaborate it further if you wish?
Yeah, I mean, the primary thing is to stop the bleeding. So the first thing you're looking at is what kind of patient is this? I mean, if you've got a chap who's child C or advanced child B, he's bled, I mean, he's done for basically. By all, the chances are this guy is not likely to survive, and it's a pre-terminal event or a terminal event. But assuming that we're looking at a child's A person, then the first thing is to stop the bleeding. The most common way of doing that is to do a TACE, control the bleeding, and then do an elective surgery. Now, I was always taught, and I don't know, I have not found much literature for this, but I was taught that in these patients who have got a free rupture into the peritoneal cavity, that one should wash out the peritoneal cavity once you've got control of the bleeding. And the idea of this was a quicker recovery from the ileus, as also supposed to be to reduce peritoneal deposits. I don't know whether that's true or not. So it's something which I have followed, is to wash them out, usually laparoscopically. And then once they've stabilized, you assess the tumor on its own merits, and using the same principles we've discussed earlier. If it is resectable, go ahead and resect.
So in practice, I mean, how many times could you resect such a tumor? I mean, if I ask you.
I have resected probably, I mean, it's a minority.
It's an anecdotal thing, right? I mean, it's
maybe
not
about 3, 4, 5, something like that. Not maybe about 3 or 4 times. I'm not more
right.
than that. Yeah.
Right. So it's not an absolute contraindication, but yeah, it's not something that you can say that it will patient will eventually may not turn out to be a resectable candidate at the end of the day.
Yeah.
He may not see the light of operation theater anyways. Okay. So, I mean, I'll quickly bring this to an end. Dr. Fani, what is your take on BCLC? I mean, this is one of the favorite things. Everybody, the hepatologists, the oncologists, they all talk about BCLC. As a surgeon, we find it's very restrictive. How do you feel about it? Do you it yourself as per the BCLC guidelines, or you are happy offering resections to patients who are beyond BCLC, even in intermediate stage where you have multinodular tumors and even with venous involvement and even with the nodes. So what is your take on violating the so-called sacrosanct rules of BCLC?
I mean, the BCLC, anything beyond 3 centimeters, it puts it in intermediate stage, and it's a more of a Western driven where transplant is affordable and available for everyone, So it's in that kind of setting. In my setting, how if a patient comes to me, I see, the basic, like you said, the tumor, patient, and the LFT assessment. Then I put all the 6 options from ablation, resection, TACE, which all are possible. Then based on the performance status and the sort of the more equally important, the financial status of the patient, what all are the options in this patient? So that's simple. I mean, the BCLC is a good staging, but like you said, it's in several areas it's lacking for us. It's very much anti-resection, I feel, because a lot of patients.
It's not anti-resection, it's anti-surgeon. I would say it's not just resection, it doesn't give too many options for transplant surgeons as well. So Murli, what is your take on BCLC? I think you would be more than happy to violate its norms.
Usually I don't want to follow it, but at the end of the day, most of the time, considering the financial aspect, they will end up most of the cases in TACE or RFA, even though we want to go ahead with surgery. I don't want to follow BCLC, but most of the time, because of financial constraints, when we give the option, because surgery or transplant versus RFA or TACE, most of the persons, they will take for a loco-regional therapy only. So,
right. Arif, what is your take on this? I mean,
yeah, definitely BCLC is too restrictive. It needs to be modified and expanded because surgery has been shown in a number of studies to have a better overall survival and disease-free survival in comparison to loco-regional therapies.
Right.
So definitely.
Perfect. And Dr. Viswajit, I mean, lastly, your take on this? I mean, are you happy following BCLC or you are happy?
No, I don't follow that much of BCLC, sir.
Hello.
I guess we started.
can I add one point on HCC rupture?
Please go ahead while he's getting back onto.
Actually, most of the patients, they are very elderly. When they come to the casualty with the HCC bleed, even bland, instead of TACE, you can just transarterial embolization. We can
embolization. You're right. It's not. They don't need TACE. They
don't
need an embolization. Sorry, I used the wrong word. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Absolutely. Or low dose chemo. Or I have done one surgery recently, but the thing is, like after 3 months, he came up with recurrence in the lung. Even though
sorry, I again got logged out. I'm very sorry. My network is giving me a lot of trouble today.
So, I think that your patients with tumor rupture are a very high risk group, and in case you do, also you should give them at least a waiting time to look at the biology, and you should resect very selected patients.
Right. I think. Sorry, I mean, go on, Dr. Fani. Sorry to cut you off.
No, nothing.
It's a very uncommon phenomena, but the capsular breach of HCC infiltrating the diaphragm or infiltrating the colon, if everything else is, good for resection, that doesn't necessarily, we would go ahead in that scenario.
So in a tumor rupture, you'll have one specific patient in which you have that exophytic kind of a tumor, which could have a very limited rupture. We have had a couple of experiences in which there was a large tumor hanging from a segment 2 and 3, and it had a spontaneous rupture, and it did not cause much of a bleed or hemodynamic instability. So in such a particular patient, I think doing a TACE won't be very safe either because of such a high extrahepatic volume, I mean, overhanging volume. So we had gone in and resected such a patient, and we had a good outcome. So that's just an anecdotal patient. But yes, like you said, tumor ruptures are not very good things to have, and probably we have to be very, very careful selecting out these patients for resections. I think we had a wonderful discussion.
One question I would like to have from the panelists. How long do we need to wait once the tumor has ruptured and we have done embolization? Is there any time frame? And before going in for surgery, whether we need to do a repeat CT scan or a PET scan to look for the metastasis?
So I don't think, Arif, there is any clear-cut guidelines to suggest how long you should wait. But in our clinical practice, I think 6 to 8 weeks of wait is something which we have done. And we would definitely restage a patient with a good quality CT and possibly a PET, depending upon how the AFP values and other things are. And if everything is clean, then diagnostic laparoscopy and then followed by resection if possible. This is the approach which I would take typically for a patient. I mean, others can also chip in.
Some of these patients will decompensate after the bleed. So many of them. So you want to wait until they regain their liver function. Basically, some of them would have had normal liver function, then they bled, then they become jaundiced, and they develop all this kind of. So you just wait until they're safe for a resection. Is what I feel. And the point that you made, Dr. Asif, about localized rupture, many of these are localized ruptures. It's much more actually. Most of the ruptures are localized ruptures rather than free peritoneal ruptures with bleeding. So that's why some of these patients do well. You're right that a free peritoneal rupture is much more likely to metastasize. And one of the reasons why this rupture occurs is because there is either due to the tumor compression or tumor thrombosis, there is occlusion of the hepatic vein. So the tumor gets congested and then it ruptures. And that's the reason why TACE is beneficial, because it cuts down the blood supply into this tumor. And that's also the reason why these patients often present with pulmonary metastasis, because they've got hepatic vein tumor thrombus as the precipitating cause for the rupture.
Agreed.
So, yeah.
Right. So I think we had a very, very fruitful discussion. Nikhil, I think we have overshooted our due limits by more than 100%. So,
can I add one more point?
Yeah,
please.
please.
Because actually when we do hepatic embolization, the things like there will be transaminitis also. The most of the time, just sir has told, it will be bleeding inside the liver just because of HVOT obstruction. So just like in a trauma, it will have a subcapsular collection, then it will bleed. So most of the time, it's not the tumor seeding which is the issue. So we can select such type of patients, embolize, and the transaminitis, once it come down, rehabilitation, nutritionally optimize the patient. If required, you can have a laparoscopic lavage or put a PCD and drain out the plain. Once that bleeding, hemoglobin, everything is safe. Then after once the transaminitis has come down, you can take up in a week or 2 weeks, depending on the performance status. Because I did one just after 2 weeks, but unfortunately, just like Sarah told, there was tumor thrombus in the left hepatic vein. Probably, and patient initial AFP came down, but after 3 months when I did the CT, there was pulmonary metastasis. Again, the AFP started going up.
Yeah.
I mean, any of these fall into the high-risk HCCs like macrovascular thrombus, rupture, doing a transplant outside criteria. But so all these things, ideally speaking, what we do in the individual patient may be different, but the ideal way, based on the current thought process, to give them some sort of a bridging therapy, give them a 3 months gap, and only if things stabilize, only then go ahead with the major surgery. At least like when it's something minor like a left lateral, it's okay. But when you're going ahead with a major surgery, like a extended right or something like that, we would really like to select these patients by giving a waiting period and looking at the biology of the tumor.
Absolutely. Perfect. I think there was a very, very enriching and very, very educating session for me. I learned a lot from you guys. Thank you so much for the part of this panel. We had some hiccups in between. I mean, mostly due to some technical glitch at my end. I'm very sorry for that. And Nikhil, I think you can take over from here. We have already overdone
way over the time. So everybody must be getting stares. So I think we should stop now. Thank you, everyone, and good night. Next is local regional and ablative therapies for hepatocellular carcinoma. So hope to see you soon. Good night.
Good
Thank
night.
you, everyone. Thank you, sir. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Murli.
Bye.
Thanks. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Thank you.
Bye, Arif.
Bye, sir. Thank you.
Like that.